"The general's son is dead," the child whispered, her voice barely audible over the clang of distant hammers. But it wasn't the enemy who killed him. It was the choice he made this morning. The centurion, whose helmet smelled of sweat and old brass, did not flinch. He gripped the girl's small wrist, the movement sharp and sudden. They were deep within the fortress walls of the Dacian border, thousands of miles from the Senate, where loyalty meant survival and silence was the only true law. The child, a kitchen slave named Lyra, had seen too much. She stared past the centurion's shoulder towards the private pavilion where the bloodline of General Silvanus, Rome's most feared warlord, rested. If the choice was known, the fragile peace secured by blood and terror would shatter, burying them all. General Gaius Silvanus stood naked before the bronze mirror, a routine he enforced every dawn, regardless of the terrain or the threat. He wasn't admiring the reflection. He was inventorying the machine that served Rome. The scars were a tapestry of loyalty. The long white line across his ribs from the Parthian campaign, the twisted knot on his thigh from the Germanic forests. He was 50 years old, built from marble and iron, and his authority over the 3rd Legion was absolute. A servant approached with the heavy, polished tunica of crimson, the color of spilled blood and imperial favor. Silvanus dismissed him with a curt nod before he could dress the general. Silvanus needed this moment of solitude, this brief separation from the burden of the purple. The war camp outside buzzed with the regulated noise of 10,000 men preparing for the day's march. Silvanus commanded the entire Dacian frontier, a sprawling, treacherous zone of mountains and defiant tribes. His orders, sent back to Rome, were treated as prophecy. He was Rome's shield, forged in brutality and discipline. But the machine had a single, irreparable fissure, the absence of his wife, Cornelia. She had passed 7 years prior, taking with her the one thing the general could not command: peace. He remembered the smell of her lavender oil, a scent utterly alien to this world of dirt and steel. He had sought to fill the vacuum with legacy, channeling every ounce of his ambition into his son, Marcus. Marcus. The name was a low, guttural noise in his throat. Silvanus finally put on the armor. The weight felt reassuring, a reminder of the structure that held his world from collapse. He strapped the gladius to his side, the hilt worn smooth by generations of Silvanus men. He stepped out of the tent, and the light hit him. Instantly, the tired, grieving man vanished. The general, stern, unflinching, and utterly ruthless, took his place. He walked the central thoroughfare of the Castra. Every soldier, from the lowest miles to the centurions, snapped to attention. Their salute was a thunderous, unified crack, the sound of unquestioning obedience. Silvanus saw only readiness, not men. They were tools. He stopped abruptly at the armory where the standard of the legion, the Silver Eagle, was being hoisted. "Tribune Lucius," Silvanus barked, his voice carrying the timbre of authority that required no repetition. The report from the western sector. Was the village pacified or merely silenced? Tribune Lucius, a young man who idolized the general, stammered, "Pacified, General. Their leader Drusus was apprehended. He awaits your judgment." Silvanus looked out over the distant forested hills. "Judgment is swift, Tribune, but sometimes mercy is the sharpest tool. Bring him to me at the midday meal. I want him to see what he loses before he loses everything." The casual cruelty was a calculated display of power. He was Rome, and Rome demanded stability, even if built on lies. He needed this stability now more than ever, especially with Marcus showing cracks in his own resolve. Silvanus felt a familiar, cold fear. What if Marcus was not worthy of the name? What if the softness that killed his mother was now infecting the bloodline? The thought was intolerable. The general would crush anything that threatened his legacy, even if it meant crushing his own heart. Lyra was dirt. That was her status in the sprawling hierarchy of the camp, less than a slave, more like the dust trodden under the boots of the soldiers. At 10 years old, her life was measured by the weight of the water buckets and the relentless heat of the kitchen fires. She wore a stained hemp tunic, too large and smelling perpetually of grease and smoke. Her exhaustion was a constant ache in her small legs, but she moved with a wary, practiced efficiency. Survival was a rhythm. Her visibility was her armor. No one looked at the kitchen slaves unless a bowl was dropped or a knife was missing. She was the shadow that retrieved scraps from the general's table, the silent figure scrubbing blood from the chopping block. What Lyra protected was her little brother, Titus, a babe of 2 years hidden in the relative safety of the laundry tent. Tended by an older woman too blind to be useful anywhere else, Titus was the flicker of light in her endless dark. If Rome knew she had smuggled him through the last massacre, they would be separated, sold, or worse. Lyra's goal was simple: keep moving, stay hidden, and keep Titus breathing. Today the cansazo was deeper than usual. The rumor of the general's son being killed had spread through the servants' quarters like a poison. Lyra had been present earlier that morning in the general's private receiving area, hiding behind a rack of maps, waiting to clean the spilled wine. She hadn't seen the final, fatal action, but she had seen the preceding argument. Marcus, the heir, had been pale, his face stripped of the Roman arrogance he usually wore. He hadn't been wearing his military leather. He had been holding a heavy wooden carving, a bird native to the Dacian forests, something worthless to Rome, priceless to the Dacians. Silvanus, the general, had been thunderous. His words weren't loud, but they carried the weight of marble falling. "You choose this savage trinket over the eagle. Over your name?" Lyra remembered Marcus's reply clearly, though it made no sense. "The eagle is blind, father. I choose sight." Then came the flash of metal, not a sword drawn in anger, but something small, sharp, and quick. Lyra had seen Marcus fall, not from a wound, but from the sudden, impossible surrender in his eyes. She saw the general stand over him, his face a mask of stone, before he quickly ordered the body removed and a false report of an ambush constructed. The official story was that Marcus had been killed by a remaining band of rebels during a routine patrol. Lyra knew this was a lie manufactured instantly to protect the general's image of infallible control. She knew that Marcus hadn't been killed by the enemy, but by the impossible weight of Rome's expectation. She knew Silvanus had engineered the lie. Lyra now stood by the fire pit, stirring a pot of barley gruel, the smoke burning her eyes. She gripped a small, smooth river stone in her palm, her only connection to the world before Rome. She knew the general had murdered his own son to save his legacy. She knew something that could not only destroy the most powerful man on the frontier, but also bury her and Titus in the process. She knew of the choice the heir had made, and she knew that the general had ensured that choice cost him his life. She didn't understand the complex politics, only the brutality of the act. Before we continue with this harsh tale of imperial Rome and the secrets held by the forgotten, where are you watching from today? The midday meal was a formalized ritual in the general's pavilion. Silvanus sat at the head of a long, narrow table carved from native oak, surrounded by his tribunes and centurions. He ate with methodical precision, showing no appetite, only function. Today's air was heavy, thick with feigned grief for the fallen heir. Every man at the table knew they were being watched for any sign of doubt. Lyra entered the pavilion with 2 other slaves, carrying platters of roasted wild boar and figs imported at great cost. Her head was bowed, her movements slow and deliberate, the very picture of social invisibility. But her eyes, shielded by the curtain of her greasy hair, were sharp and scanning. This was the first time she had been in the same confined space as the general since that morning. The air around him felt cold, compressed, like a mountain of granite holding back a landslide. She avoided looking at the floor where the conflict had occurred, but her small hands trembled as she set down a heavy bronze dish. Silvanus did not notice her. Why would he notice dirt? He was focused on the Dacian leader, Drusus, who had been dragged into the pavilion and forced onto his knees. Drusus, bound and bloody, refused to look at the general, his gaze fixed on the intricate mosaic floor. "Drusus," Silvanus's voice was dangerously quiet. "You chose war against the might of Rome. You chose the death of your people over the peace I offered." Drusus spat blood onto the polished stone. "I chose freedom, Governor, something your legions would never understand." As the general prepared his slow, surgical response, something shifted in the atmosphere. Lyra was refilling a goblet of wine at the general's elbow. She moved too quickly, her heart pounding from the proximity to the murderer. Her elbow brushed the table's edge, and the heavy goblet tipped. It didn't spill on the general, but on his maps, rolled out and secured by weights, which detailed the next phase of the campaign into the mountains. A splash of dark red wine spread across the strategic markings, staining the planned route. Silence descended, absolute and terrifying. Every Roman soldier held their breath. Lyra froze, her small body rigid with shock. She had violated the most basic law, disrupting the general's ritual, staining the physical manifestation of his power. Silvanus moved with unnatural slowness. He did not look at the spill, nor did he look at the frightened child. He simply placed his large, calloused hand flat on the stained map, absorbing the wine into his palm. Then his eyes, colder than winter stone, finally lifted and settled on Lyra. It was not a look of rage, but of calculation. He saw the tunic, the dirt, the fear. He saw nothing of consequence, yet his gaze lingered for 1 second too long. In that elongated moment, Lyra saw a brief, fleeting flicker behind the general's stone mask, not the general but the father who had just lost everything. A raw, terrifying emptiness. He turned back to Drusus. "Clean this mess," he ordered, not to Lyra but to the centurion. The message was clear. She was beneath even his wrath. Lyra hurried away, her legs shaking uncontrollably. She knew the moment had not been about a spilled drink. The general had looked at her, the unseen slave, and for a terrifying second their worlds had touched. The lie she carried was huge. His eyes held the monstrous weight of the truth. She felt a profound, unsettling intuition. She was now connected to his secret, not by knowledge but by attention. Something was about to break. Days turned into a grinding week. The camp, usually a model of Roman efficiency, was now a place of strained movement and low whispers. The official mourning period for Marcus had ended quickly, replaced by a hypervigilance directed by General Silvanus. The tension was palpable. Every shadow felt like a spy. Lyra kept to the periphery, scrubbing pots near the river bend where the noise of the water covered the clatter of bronze. But the image of the general's empty eyes remained burned into her memory. She was now actively searching for proof, driven not by a moral crusade, but by the stark, terrifying knowledge that if her secret, that she witnessed his crime, ever surfaced, her life and Titus's would be instantly forfeit. The general had been rigorous in crafting the narrative of the ambush, but Lyra found the inconsistency not in the bodies or the gear, but in the small details of Marcus's private quarters, which she was tasked with cleaning and preparing for burning. A Roman purification ritual. Marcus had been an obsessive collector of small, specific things, maps of the non-Roman world, samples of local flora, and wooden carvings. When she entered the tent, a heavy guard stood outside, ensuring the heir's possessions were catalogued before their destruction. Lyra began folding the expensive silk tunics, trying to stay detached. The air was thick with the scent of his favorite oil, cedar wood. That's when she saw it, or rather, didn't see it. Marcus, despite his high rank, had always worn a specific fibula, a plain bronze clasp used to secure his cloak, which was engraved with a tiny, poorly executed carving of a wolf he claimed to have etched himself as a boy. Lyra had seen it 100 times, glinting in the light. Now the cloak was there, draped over a chest, but the fibula was gone. She searched everywhere, her small hands moving quickly and silently through the belongings. The tribunes had meticulously listed every piece of armor, every scroll, every ring, but the simple, worthless bronze clasp was missing. Why would the enemy take a cheap clasp, yet leave behind valuable rings and a highly decorated dagger? It was illogical. If Marcus had been killed by rebels, the body would have been stripped of everything useful. The fibula was not useful, but it was essential to his daily attire. Suddenly, Lyra remembered the carving Marcus had been holding during the argument, the Dacian wooden bird. The general hadn't let go of it when Marcus fell. He had taken both the bird carving, the choice Marcus made, and the fibula, the symbol of Marcus's personal loyalty, however conflicted. It was a perfect, terrible logic. The general hadn't just murdered his son. He had erased the pieces of his son that contradicted the narrative of a heroic Roman death. The clasp was a private shame, a sign of softness. He wanted Marcus to be remembered as a perfect tool, not a flawed man seeking escape. Lyra's breath hitched. This was proof, not of the murder, anyone could lose a clasp, but proof of the general's deliberate, controlling intent to fabricate the entire identity of the dead man. It was the general's signature on the lie. She felt a paralyzing wave of terror. The detail was meaningless to the Romans, a trivial loss. But to Lyra, it was the key to understanding the monstrous coldness of Silvanus. To speak of it meant inviting the general's calculated wrath. It was safer to remain dirt, to disappear back into the smoke. But if the general was capable of extinguishing his own bloodline for the sake of his image, what chance did a kitchen slave and her hidden infant brother have? The secret felt hot and heavy in her chest. She needed to act, not for justice, but for pure, desperate survival. The silence felt like complicity, and complicity was a slower death. Lyra knew she could not confront the general. Power did not debate, it crushed. Her only chance lay in making the truth visible, but only to someone who might have the courage or the leverage to question the general. That person was not in the camp. She needed to get a message to Rome, to the Senate, or to the imperial legate, but how? She couldn't write, and the Roman system was airtight against unauthorized communication. Later that evening, the camp was unusually quiet. The general was holding a final strategy session with his most trusted praetors regarding the planned push into the mountains. Lyra was working late in the kitchen, slicing hardtack for the morning's rations, her mind racing. She remembered that the general was preparing a major shipment of rare metals and furs, the spoils of the recent campaign, to be sent back to Rome as a political gesture of triumph. The shipment was scheduled to leave before dawn. Lyra took the smooth river stone she always carried, her connection to Titus and the world outside the camp. She placed it inside a small leather pouch that had once held Marcus's favorite spice, then tied the pouch to her belt. She waited until the final shift change. The kitchens were deserted, only the embers of the great hearth glowing. Moving with the practiced stealth of a hunted animal, she slipped out, navigating the maze of tents toward the supply depot where the shipment was guarded. The depot was a large, low-slung building, protected by 2 sleepy guards. Lyra pressed herself into the shadows of a large siege weapon, waiting for the moon to pass behind a cloud. When the moment came, she darted past the guards, her heart beating like a trapped bird. She found the enormous wooden crate stamped with the imperial seal, ready for transport. The smell of cedar and raw hide was overwhelming. These were the general's trophies, his proof of loyalty and success. She had to be quick. She needed to place the proof where it would be found by the recipient in Rome, not by the guards here. She found a small, loose panel on the side of the largest crate, containing precious raw silver, a gift for a powerful senator. Lyra worked the panel free with a rusty kitchen knife she had stolen. The metal shrieked softly, a sound that seemed deafening in the silence. She pushed the small leather pouch, containing only the river stone, deep into the packing straw inside the crate. It was not the fibula. The general had that locked away. But the river stone was a specific, non-Roman object found only near the Dacian stream where Marcus often went to draw, sketching the local birds. It was utterly out of place among Roman spoils. It was a sign of the truth, inserted into the heart of the general's lie, a foreign object placed within the proof of his absolute Roman success. She sealed the panel back, her fingers slick with effort. She stumbled back towards the kitchens, shaking. The act was done. She hadn't confessed, she hadn't pointed a finger. She had merely placed a stone, an object of no value, inside a fortune. The immediate consequence arrived before she reached the safety of the firelight. A centurion making his final round saw her shadowy form. "Halt! Who goes there?" the centurion demanded, his torch flaring. Lyra froze. She didn't run. Running was guilt. She turned slowly, her small hands raised in surrender. "Kitchen slave, sir," she whispered, forcing her voice to be dull and subservient. "I was returning to fetch my bucket. I misplaced it." The centurion eyed her suspiciously, his gaze lingering on the dark smudge of dirt on her cheek. The lie felt thin as parchment. He took one step closer, his boot crunching on the gravel. Lyra's breath caught. If he searched her, if he questioned her path. "Get back to your duties, slave," he finally sneered, satisfied by her terror. "If you are caught wandering again, I'll see you cleaning latrines for a month." He dismissed her, his attention already elsewhere. Lyra fled, disappearing back into the safety of the shadows. The danger had been real, physical and immediate. The history of the camp had shifted. The lie of General Sylvanus was now traveling, sealed in a crate, toward Rome. 3 weeks later, the air of the Dacian command post did not shift with the weather. It shifted with the tenor of the dispatches from Rome. General Sylvanus was in his war room, charting troop movements, when the imperial messenger arrived. The messenger was not a simple courier. He was a senatorial aide, young, arrogant, and clearly rattled by the frontier's harshness. The aide handed Sylvanus a scroll sealed with the personal signet of Legate Servius, the emperor's right hand in the Senate. Sylvanus broke the seal with a practiced, brutal motion. His eyes scanned the precise, demanding script. The legate requested an immediate, detailed explanation regarding an anomaly found in the recent shipment of spoils. Sylvanus's control wavered for a fraction of a second. An anomaly? He had personally overseen the manifests. He dismissed the aide, his voice sharp enough to draw blood. Once alone, he read the passage again. The gift of raw silver was appreciated, General. However, within the packing material, a peculiar stone was recovered. It is a smooth, river-worn granite utterly foreign to the wealth of Rome. Legate Servius requires assurance that this object is not a form of coded communication with rebel factions, particularly given the recent and sudden loss of your son, Marcus. Explain its purpose immediately, or the Senate will be forced to conclude certain unfortunate possibilities. The world narrowed to the scroll in his hand. A stone from the river. Sylvanus didn't need to ask who had noticed the stone. Marcus had carried one like it since he was a boy, a souvenir from a childhood trip to the Danube. But more critically, Marcus had given one of those stones to that little Dacian slave girl, Lyra, during one of his misplaced acts of charity months ago. The image of the child spilling wine on his maps, her eyes wide with fear, snapped into sharp focus. The general felt the cold grip of fury, but underneath it, a profound, chilling realization. His crime had been exposed, not by ambition or politics, but by a piece of river grit delivered by an invisible hand. The stone wasn't proof of murder. It was an accusation of a lie, suggesting that Marcus's death was connected to something local, personal, and non-Roman. It was an intolerable breach of his narrative. "Tribune Lucius!" Sylvanus roared, a sound that ripped through the quiet discipline of the fortress. Lucius rushed in, snapping to attention. The kitchen staff, the slaves, catalogued them. Find the girl who served the main pavilion 3 weeks ago. The small one. Filthy. Bring her to me. Now. Sylvanus began pacing the narrow tent, his long strides tearing up the dried earth. He wasn't thinking about the political fallout yet. He was thinking about control. The lie was essential. Without the narrative of a heroic Roman son felled by the savage enemy, Sylvanus was a murderer who had placed his ambition above his blood. His legacy, his power, everything was built on the foundation of his name. The need to find Lyra became an absolute urgency. She was the only link between the misplaced stone and the truth of the general's morning argument with Marcus. If she spoke, the legate would have enough to justify a full imperial investigation. A slow political strangulation Sylvanus could not survive. He grabbed his dagger, the weight familiar and comforting. This wasn't a war against tribes anymore. This was a private execution, a necessary removal of an impurity. The girl had to be located, questioned until the source of the information was certain, and then erased. Sylvanus would personally guarantee that this time there would be no loose ends, no lingering proof of his internal fracture. He was Rome, and Rome did not tolerate witnesses to its weaknesses. Lyra was dragged into the general's pavilion, her arms held tightly by 2 burly centurions. Tribune Lucius, visibly nervous, stood to the side. The pavilion was stripped bare, devoid of the trappings of power, making the general's presence even more monumental. Sylvanus stood waiting, his hands clasped behind his back, his face a perfect void of emotion. He did not yell. He spoke with the deadly calm of a judge pronouncing a death sentence. "Lyra," he began, the name foreign and clumsy on his tongue, You know what happens to those who betray the confidence of the general. Lyra refused to meet his gaze. She looked at the floor where the spilled wine had been, where Marcus had fallen. The centurions tightened their grips, urging her to speak, but she remained silent, the memory of Titus her only armor. "The stone," Silvanus said, taking a single, slow step closer. "Tell me how the stone, the one found in the silver shipment, came to be there. Tell me who instructed you." Lyra swallowed hard. Her voice was a cracked whisper. "No one instructed me, General. I found it." "Found it where?" "In the stream, sir, near the washing rocks." It was a partial truth, designed to sound accidental. Silvanus laughed, a sound that held no humor, only contempt. "Do you truly believe, child, that a senator of Rome would bother himself with common stream rocks? The stone was important to my son Marcus. It symbolized his fascination with the local savages. You know this. You saw him with it." The lie was crumbling fast. Lyra's breath hitched. She realized the general was not trying to protect his name, but to protect the lie of Marcus's loyalty. "Marcus, he wanted to leave, General," Lyra finally whispered, the words painful to extract. The admission was a catalyst. Silvanus moved, swift as a viper, closing the distance instantly. He grabbed her chin, forcing her head up to look into his eyes. His touch was cold, his strength terrifying. "He wanted to leave Rome?" Silvanus hissed, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble only she could hear. "He chose the forest over the forum? Say it, child. Did he try to run?" "He said the eagle was blind." Lyra wept, the memory overwhelming her. "He said he chose sight. He held the bird carving." The general's facade finally shattered. The rigid posture faltered. He released her chin, stepping back as if struck. His eyes, for a terrifying moment, were not fixed on Lyra, but on the invisible scene playing out in his memory. "The bird," Silvanus murmured, his voice now thick with something terrible. "He chose the insignificance of that worthless wood over a general's command." Tribune Lucius shuffled nervously. He had heard too much. Lyra seized the opportunity. "You took the fibula, General, the wolf clasp. The enemy would not have left the gold rings, but taken a simple bronze pin. You erased him. You killed him not because he was a traitor, but because he was a failure." The truth, stark and brutal, hung in the heavy air. Silvanus looked at the small girl, the piece of dirt who held his doom. He saw not a slave, but a witness who had watched him choose power over love, honor over fatherhood. The lie of the heroic ambush collapsed entirely. He had killed his only son over a matter of image, a rejection of the Roman machine. The centurions looked from the general's ruined face to the trembling child, uncertain of who held the power now. The power of the general had been absolute. The power of the truth was proving to be greater. General Silvanus stood motionless, the accusation of the slave girl ringing in the stunned silence. He had achieved total control over the frontier, but he had lost control of his own history. Tribune Lucius, witnessing the raw collapse of his hero, finally found his voice. "General," Lucius began, his voice barely a squeak, "I must document this, for the records." Silvanus turned to Lucius, his gaze murderous. But the power to simply erase the tribune was gone. Lucius represented the law, the imperial machine that had always been Silvanus's protection. Now that machine was demanding accountability. The stone had reached the legate. The word failure was echoing in the highest halls of Rome. "Document nothing," Silvanus commanded, though the command lacked its usual force. "The girl lies. She is a savage sympathizer." Lyra stepped forward, her fear replaced by a chilling clarity. "The bird carving is still here, General. You took it from him. It is not listed in the inventory of his possessions because it was the proof of his final choice." Silvanus knew it was true. He kept the carving in a locked chest, the one piece of evidence he couldn't bear to destroy, a constant reminder of the profound rejection he had suffered. He had kept it as a trophy of his own ruthless adherence to duty. The centurions, seeing the tribune's visible distress and the general's hesitation, loosened their grip on Lyra. The order was unclear, and in the Roman military, ambiguity meant weakness. The consequences began immediately, not with a Senate decree, but with the crumbling of loyalty. Tribune Lucius, pale but firm, made his choice. "Centurions," Lucius stated, his voice trembling but gaining strength. "Under the laws of the Empire concerning the preservation of evidence in cases of high treason and suspected murder, you are to secure the general's private quarters and await a direct order from Legate Servius. I will draft the report of the witness's testimony." The two centurions exchanged a quick, meaningful glance. The choice was between an accused murderer and the distant yet unyielding rule of Rome. They stepped away from Lyra and positioned themselves near the entrance of the general's tent. The transfer of authority was silent, complete. Silvanus was under house arrest, sanctioned by the very law he had served. Silvanus looked at Lyra one last time, not with hatred but with a desolate acknowledgement. She was the messenger of his ruin, the smallest thing that broke the largest man. The price of his truth was the immediate and humiliating loss of his life's work. The Dacian campaign would be taken over by a rival. His name would be stripped from the annals of victory. He had sacrificed his son for his legacy, and now the sacrifice had destroyed the legacy. Lyra felt no triumph. She saw only a powerful man utterly alone, consumed by the same machine he had used to crush others. Her separation from the general was finalized. She had spoken the truth and she had survived the immediate fallout. But she understood that her life now belonged to the unfolding political drama. She was no longer just a slave. She was imperial evidence. She had purchased her safety with the general's downfall. The fall of General Silvanus was swift and exemplary. He was recalled to Rome under heavy guard, the disgrace monumental. The general did not fight or plead. He embraced his fate with the same iron rigor he had applied to war, a final cold act of Roman duty. He knew the Senate would not forgive the lie, nor the threat to imperial stability. Lyra remained at the frontier camp, now under the nervous, protective custody of Tribune Lucius. She was no longer kitchen dirt, but the witness, a fragile, necessary figure in the trial to come. The initial threat to her life had lifted, replaced by the weight of her testimony. Her small frame had absorbed the force of the Empire's moral crisis and had not broken. Lucius, burdened by his new role, ensured Lyra was given clean clothes and adequate food. He treated her not as a slave but as a person, a choice that marked his own transformation from a blind admirer of power to a servant of the law. The greatest change, however, was in her freedom to be a mother. Because she was now crucial to the imperial case, Lyra was allowed to bring Titus from the laundry tent into a small private cubicle. One morning, the sun streamed through the canvas opening. Lyra sat on the floor, Titus asleep on a blanket beside her. She picked up the small wooden bird carving, the one Lucius had retrieved from Silvanus's chest, and turned it over in her palm. Marcus had died for choosing something simple and human over the monstrous expectations of his father. His sacrifice, though unintended, had bought her and Titus a chance at life. Lyra touched Titus's soft cheek. His survival was no longer a secret, furtive struggle, but a necessity protected by the law of Rome. She might still be a slave, but her testimony had given her an undeniable status. She had dignity, a small, hard-won territory that could not be taken away. She had faced the greatest power on the frontier and had emerged with her humanity intact. Later that day, Lucius approached, his expression weary. "You will be brought to Rome, Lyra. You will speak the truth before the legate. Do not fear. The general's influence is gone." Lyra nodded, clutching the wooden bird. She was heading into the heart of the empire that had consumed Marcus and Silvanus, but she was going with a future in her arms. She had learned that the most powerful force was not the sword, but the unvarnished truth, spoken by the weakest voice. They boarded the transport wagon at dusk. As they left the fortress walls, the monument to Silvanus's collapsed ambition, Lyra looked back only once. The fear was still there, but it was accompanied by a new, fragile hope. She had not achieved freedom, but she had achieved survival through moral choice. And that, in Rome, was a victory rarer than any conquest. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales like this one.